All right. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name's Jim Crispino, and this is our DevCast webinar series that we do. This session is going to cover client applications and interaction widgets. I'll talk about what those are in just a second. Um, I am the Senior Director of Developer Engagement. I work on the product management team and also on the App Foundry team here at Genesys, helping our partners build integrations that are available to our customers through the App Foundry marketplace. Just before we launch in, I am recording this, and I will upload this to our Genesys community YouTube channel. You can get to this video and any of our past videos through the Developer Center at developer.genesys.cloud/video, or click on the big video link on the landing page of our Developer Center. And with that, I am done with slides, and we'll just hop right into talking about client apps and interaction widgets. So let me get out of that, get rid of that. So client applications and interaction widgets. Maybe the easiest thing to do is to show you what they are. So both of them are a related topic. Genesys Cloud, the main UI of Genesys Cloud, has the ability to iframe third-party web applications to make those applications available to your agents as they're using Genesys Cloud or handling interactions. We have 3 iframe locations. A traditional custom client app can be hosted in one of 2 areas. One can be a standalone app, meaning it's available on one of the menus up here. The apps menu is the traditional place for a custom client app to be hosted. So you may have any number of applications that you add to this. Each of these is a defined iframe. And when you click on it, for instance, here I have Wikipedia, and I have iframed Wikipedia in here in Genesys Cloud. Now that's a trivial example, right? No one would really iframe Wikipedia for their agents, probably not anyway. But you might iframe your CRM. You might iframe a line of business system. You might iframe some tool or utility that agents commonly use to work on their day-to-day business. So that's the big real estate iframe off the apps menu is what we call the standalone apps location. So that's the first location. The second one, which you may or may not have, so the apps menu is not visible unless you have custom client apps defined. The widgets panel over here, the apps panel over here, is also not visible unless you have apps that are defined in the widget location. So if you click on that, that slides out, and you can see in a tabbed view, there can be multiple tabs up here to let you switch between multiple widget apps that are available to your agents. Now, why you would choose the apps menu location over the widget panel is more of a usability thing. The apps menu wants to have the full real estate. The iframes of the applications on the apps menu want to have the full real estate of the UI, and the widgets just slide in and out. So they're a little more convenient, but you'll just have to determine where you would want your agents to reference those applications. Now, custom client apps, those 2 that I just talked about off the apps menu or off the widgets panel, they are not interaction aware. They have no idea what interaction or interactions the agent's handling, which interaction is currently in view. You should not use either one of those for any kind of interaction handling user interface. Okay. So for web apps that should be made available to your agents while they're handling an interaction, that is a similar but different type of iframe, and we call that an interaction widget. Not to be confused with our widget panel, okay? But interaction widgets are widgets that are made available to interactions. And let me just show you what one of those looks like, and we'll dig more into interaction widgets here in a minute. Let me get a call going.
Hello. Thanks for calling the DevCast
Let me go on queue. You can always show interaction widgets while you're handling an interaction. So let me get an interaction into the system. Mute both of those so we don't get a lot of feedback. So as you're using the Genesys Cloud user interface, you all are most likely aware of our current widget sets. So we've got the wrap-up widget, we've got our AI co-pilot, we've got our schedule a callback, call notes, canned responses. We've got our standard widgets that are available to agents, the contact widget, the journey widget. You can add widgets to this panel as well. So you can see a couple of custom widgets up here. I've got a DevCast interaction widget that I built. It just redirects to Wikipedia. I've got another widget that we're going to talk about more in this DevCast. So you can add web applications. So as an agent is handling a call or multiple chats or whatever, this widget can pop up, and they are interaction aware. They know each iframe is tied to the selected interaction on the roster over here on the left. So your interaction widget knows what interaction the agent is currently handling and can render a user interface specific to that conversation. So it has access to the conversation JSON, to the participant attributes. You can pull those participant attributes out and use those as you render your UI so that you can make an informed UI for your agent based on those participant attributes. So if you've collected an account number in Architect, attach that as data, that gets sent with the call to the agent. You can pull that account number and you can render a web app in here that looks up that account number and offers data about that account to the agent. So interaction widgets. So a lot of people go, well, why would I develop an interaction widget versus using an agent script? So agent scripts are very powerful. Most of you probably know what those are. Those render kind of in this bigger panel here for the call. Agent scripts are usually those talking points for telemarketing, sales, maybe even customer service where you need to collect a certain amount of data. They can be multi-page. They can iframe applications as well. There is a web component available within a script. But if you want things to be available to your agent regardless of the page on the script that they're on, or you don't want to alter your scripts, interaction widgets can be a useful tool to have over here on the right-hand side so that you don't mess with your scripts. All right, so talked about what they are, talked about the two different types, and I've shown you where they are. So let's talk about how to set these up. So I'm going to hang up this call. Let me disposition it. Give me a second. Mark that done. All right. In admin, if you have admin access and you can get to integrations, let's talk about the client apps. So those are the ones off the apps menu or off of that widget sidebar. So if you go to admin and you go to integrations and you click on add integration up here in the upper right-hand corner, look for client application, and it's right here. So I've got a couple. In yours, it might be the first thing that comes up, but client application is a built-in integration type. It should be available on your orgs by default. And you can click install, and if you click install, it's going to take you to a panel where you can name your interaction widget. So this name is what's going to show up on the apps menu. So name it something that your agents would recognize. And then there's some configuration you can set up. An application URL. What's the URL that you want to iframe? Where do you want it? So you can pick standalone or widget. So that's the apps menu or that widget sidebar location. If you pick standalone, you have a couple of options. The default is the apps menu. Like I said, if you do nothing else, it'll show up on the apps menu. But if you have, say you want to iframe a BI tool or a report system or some kind of dashboard, you might want that off of, say, the performance menu where all the Genesys dashboards are. That's Contact Center Insights is the performance menu. It's kind of the legacy name for that. Directory is the other one. So if you have something maybe related to contacts and people and third parties that you want to make available to your agents, you might stick an extra menu option under the directory. So you can pick where that standalone item shows up on that top level menu. As with any iframe, there's iframe sandbox options. What do you want to, what allow flags do you want to turn on for that iframe? Content security policy permissions can also be specified for like camera and microphone access and such. And then the last piece of this is who should be able to see this widget. So by default, they're hidden. If you set everything up and you do not select a group, this interaction is not going to show up for anyone. So you have to define an agent group, a group of agents that this application will be made available, and you have to select that. So if I go back and I just look at my Wikipedia one, you can see I named it Wikipedia. I gave it wikipedia.org. I put it on the standalone menu. I don't know why I gave it camera and microphone access. I probably did that just to show. And I made it available to my everyone. In my org, I've got an everyone group just because we're lazy and we don't want to separate it out by people in our org. So I made it available to everyone. And when you save, it is not a dynamic update of the apps menu. So if you were to save that and directly go to the apps menu, Wikipedia wouldn't show up if you were originally just defining it. You have to reload. It's the apps menu gets read and rendered on load time. So you either have to log out and log back in or just reload the browser. And when you do that, it'll query all the client apps that the logged in user has access to based on their agent group, and it will render the apps menu and the sidebar widgets appropriately. One additional thing that I want to talk about, let's go back into that Wikipedia. Actually, what I might do is we'll look at this one. So along with the configuration of the regular properties, there is an advanced. Oh, I don't have anything on that one. We'll talk about advanced on interaction widgets because it actually works better on interaction widgets. There are additional tabs. There's an advanced tab, and I'll show you kind of what the properties are for that. And then there's a credentials tab that's not utilized. And the last thing, this is often overlooked, the support tab will give you some links to support of that application. And the nice thing about this is if you have questions about any of the setup of an interaction widget, if you just click on that link, it takes you straight into the resource center for setting up a client application integration. So you don't have to go to the resource center. You don't have to search. It'll take you straight to the documentation for how to set up a client application. And you can always go back to the main article for how to set them up, what they are, how to deactivate them, reactivate them, etc. All right, before I go too much further, it looks like Lewis posted a question. Can an integration be set up to be division aware rather than groups? Seems a pain to have to create various different groups when users are usually split over divisions. Interactions are not yet division aware. So it is what it is. I understand that's a pain. Agent groups are the only way right now to control visibility of client apps. And let's see, Brian posted, why didn't Genesys give an option to all users to see? That's a good question. I don't have an answer for that. That's a valid, that would be a good idea to put on the ideas portal. We actually, so at Genesys, we use Genesys Cloud. internally as well. And we have some apps we make available to our product management team. And we wanted it made available. We wanted some apps made available to the entire company. And yeah, we had to go through the exercise of creating a group with the entire company in it to make that app available. So Brian, I understand your query there and why that would be valuable. It would be a good idea. There was another last question before I go on is, if no group is selected, will that enable access to all? No, it will hide it. It actually says that. So you don't even have to think about it. So if you go to the configuration and in the group filtering, it says hidden if no group is selected. So it's right there. It's in plain text. If you don't select a group, that app is not visible to anyone. All right. So now, talked about, so after you set up an integration, you have to toggle it to make it active. You have to toggle it up here or toggle it in the list. In the list, there's a status column. You have to make it active. After you make it active, you have to reload, and that's when that web app will show up on the apps menu or the sidebar. All right, let's talk about interaction widgets now as well, because they're similar. Related. So they're also on in integrations, add integration, in interaction widget. All right, so interaction widget, it's the one that's the little app with a headphone on because it works with interactions. So you'd click install on that, and that has similar properties. I'm going to show you the one that I have called my favorites widget, which we're going to be talking about for the rest of this webinar. So I've given my widget a name. The name shows up as a tooltip. So you do want to name this something that your agents might see. They'll see a branded icon on the widgets panel there that should give them some indication of what it is. But you might want to put in a name they'll recognize. So if they hover over that icon, it tells them. Similar to a custom client app, there's an application URL. My favorites widget is hosted out on GitHub Pages because that's just where I host things. Again, there are sandbox options and iframe feature policies that you can set, and there's group filtering. But interaction widgets expand on that for a couple more items. And all of these are additive. So the more you put in, the more restrictive it becomes, I guess, is the way to put that. You have a group, right? You have the overall group of agents that should be able to see that widget, and the queue that it should be you can filter on queue. So group filtering, as some of the questions posed, if you leave it blank, why doesn't it render for everybody? It's a valid question. If you leave group filtering blank, it hides it for everyone. But the rest of these, like for queues, if you leave it blank, there will be no queue filtering. It will show up for every queue in your contact center, which you may not want, right? You may have an interaction widget used by, say, the billing team that renders finance data. You might not want that available to the customer support team, right? So on queues that are related to the billing team, you would want that widget available, but on queues related to customer support, you would not. So there you might want to specify queue filtering. You also might have widgets that are available for certain interaction types. You might have a widget that's specifically available for voice calls, but not for chats, or not for Facebook, or not for emails, right? So you can define which media type that widget should be rendered for. Again, leaving blank will result in no communication type filtering, which means it'll be available for all media types. So if you leave it blank, it'll be available for everyone. And then lastly, you've probably seen or heard that we now offer work automation type interactions. These are back office interaction types. just think of them as maybe a case or a ticket or some item that needs to be worked. It's not a conversational interaction. So work items can render widgets as well. You have to turn that functionality on. And if you do turn that on, it tells you you can only support work items if you set the communication type filtering to none. So you have to put none up here and turn that on to true if you want that available for work items. So work item specific interaction widgets have to be set up a certain way. On the advanced tab, so I talked about this a little earlier for custom client apps. There is an advanced tab, and there are things that you can set up both for client apps and interaction widgets. And there is a schema available. You can download the schema. There's a button here that lets you download the schema with all the properties that you can set. And these properties are talked about in the documentation. So if we hop over to the Dev Center, the documentation for client apps is you just click on any link and go to Platform, Integrations, Client Apps. There's a good overview, talks about what I just talked about with the 3 locations, and we'll dig into some of this. On advanced concepts, it will talk about the life cycle events, what you can specify, and some other things. So in mine, ephemeral, that means can your application be loaded and unloaded at will? Is it okay if the Genesys UI offloads your application? And if that iframe is re-rendered, you can reinitialize. So you can decide whether you want Genesys Cloud to consider your app for resource destruction to free up memory. If you say false, Genesys Cloud will do its best attempt to keep your widget loaded or your client app loaded. There still is limits. There's only so many iframes we'll keep in memory at one time, but we'll do our best. So if you say false there, we'll do our best to keep your widget in memory. Otherwise, your widget's going to have to reload and reinitialize each time. There are also event hooks. We can tell you when your widget loads. That's the bootstrap. So when you'll get a bootstrap event when your widget's loading, you'll get a stop event when your widget is going to be torn down, and then you'll get a blur focus pair when your focus is when your interaction widget has focus, and blur is when it doesn't. So you can be aware of those events. And then there's, you can set up icons, the tabbed icons. These are the locations where we'll pull those. And there are other properties, and they're talked about in the documentation. Here you can do localization. So the menu items on the apps menu that show up, you can localize those if you want. If you don't want everything to be in English, you can specify names based on I-18N definitions. So again, no credentials, and the support menu will take you to the article on the Resource Center. All right. Just like client apps, interaction widgets, if once you define one, activate it, you have to reload or log out and log back in for that interaction widget to become available. All right. So what's it take to develop an interaction widget? Let me kind of show you the typical flow of how this works and see if I can make that a little bit bigger so it's not an eye chart. We'll kind of walk through this. So Genesys Cloud, depending on the location, there's an iframe, and Genesys is going to load your application URL based on the URL in the configuration tab. And we're going to, I did not talk about those yet. Actually, yeah, before we step through this, let's talk about those because that's helpful. For any of the client app or the interaction widget, if we look at the configuration of the URL, not only do you tell it like you know, what's the HTML to load in that iframe. But if we scroll out here to the right, you'll see I've got a couple of query parameters here. Genesys has some built-in query parameters that we can provide to you. For an interaction widget, we have the conversation ID. So we will pass you the conversation ID that this interaction widget should be linked to. That's how I told you their interaction widgets are conversation aware. So they're conversation aware based on this query parameter. So we pass that in to you so that you can make API requests to get that conversation JSON and to operate that on. We also pass in the language tag that should be used. So based on what the customer has set up for that agent or their browser settings, we'll pass in the language tab, so the tag, so that you can render a user interface using an I18N library. And then to initialize the SDKs, we pass in two properties: target environment, GC target environment, and GC host origin. Those have no meaning to you whatsoever. Okay, they're really of no use, but you need those two properties to pass into our SDKs to initialize them so that they point to the correct region that your org is in. So you want your interaction widget to hit your org in the region that it's in and not some other region. If you don't pass those in, our SDKs are built to recognize the US East region by default. So, you know, if your org is on a different region and you don't pass those in, you're never going to get logged in. You're never going to get authenticated. Your widget's not going to, your widget or client app is not going to work. And then lastly, you can pass in any other query parameter that your application needs on here. Genesys doesn't care what you put there. You can put as many query parameters as is legal for a URL. But the four I've mentioned, Genesys will supply to you. And you can get a definition of those four. Those are in the documentation as well. If you go to the client apps and just the main overview page, and you go to URL interpolation. So that's a funky word, just meaning we're going to replace one value with another. I actually had to look up interpolation the other day. Here's some examples. So, you know, we show you, if you use a URL, you know, you can use these GC parameters. We'll pass them into you. There's a description of the parameters, what they're used for. And if you have a legacy, if you've already built an interaction widget or a custom client app, you may be using some legacy PC for Pure Cloud, the old Pure Cloud query parameters. We are deprecating those. We sent out a deprecation notice on our announcements forum. If you're subscribed to that, you should have gotten some announcement that we are deprecating those, and you need to move to using the new GC, the new Genesys Cloud query parameters. I don't think there's an end of life yet for when we're going to really get rid of those, when they will no longer work, but it would be better to be proactive and go take care of those sooner rather than later. All right, so that's query parameters. So let's go back to that Miro diagram. So let's talk about how all that works. So Genesys is going to load your iframe. We're going to load that URL. We're going to replace the lang tag, the target environment, the host origin, the conversation ID with actual valid values based on the UI that's running for that agent. And we're going to load your app. So the first thing your app should do, that I recommend that your app should do, is parse those query parameters. Parse them off of the URL and store them somewhere, okay? So store them in memory, store them in local storage, do what you want with them, but pull them off the URL. You're going to need those to, first of all, initialize the Client Apps SDK. So that's the documentation we're looking here. This client app, it is an SDK. It's loaded right here. So you can load the SDK. I'll show you the HTML here in a minute. But you'll load up our Client Apps SDK, and that will initialize the client app. So the client apps SDK allows your iframe to communicate with the rest of the Genesys UI. Then, secondly, most likely, you're going to want to make Genesys Cloud API requests. So after you initialize the Client Apps SDK, you're probably going to initialize the Platform SDK as well, so that you can make those API requests to the Genesys backend to get the conversation JSON, to make updates to that conversation, to do whatever it is your app is doing with the API. Okay, and so you'll initialize the two SDKs, and then you're going to check if your app is authenticated. Do you have an OAuth access token? So anything working with Genesys that's going to make an API request needs OAuth authentication. In terms of an interaction widget or a client app, that's either an implicit grant OAuth client, meaning everything runs client side, so you're going to do an implicit grant, or an authorization code grant if you're writing something that's running on a server side. So if you're running, a Java server of some kind, something in Azure, something in AWS, where your app is running on a server, that's probably an authentication code grant or authorization code grant flow. Either way, you're going to check if you're authenticated, see if you have an access token. The SDK does that for you. The SDK checks if you are already authenticated. So you just have to ask the SDK, hey, are you authenticated? If it's not, your code is going to offload, and that iframe is going to be directed over to Genesys Cloud's login screen. The agent's going to have to log in and authenticate if they're not already authenticated. So your app gets offloaded for a minute. You get to see Genesys. Agent logs in, they enter their username, password, maybe select their region, maybe put in their org name. They authenticate, just standard Genesys authentication. And then it's going to redirect back to your application. So it re-enters your application, it reloads your iframe. But this time, instead of the query parameters being there, you get different query parameters because this is a return from the login, not the initial load of the iframe. So to maintain those query parameters, you either had to store them off in local storage, or my recommendation, when you log into Genesys, there's a state parameter on the login request. Take that entire query string and stuff it in the state parameter, because after Genesys logs in, they will return you that state parameter back. And so you can access that state parameter, get your original query string back, and then you go through again and reinitialize all the SDKs. This time you're authenticated, and now you can do authenticated things. Okay, so I'm going to stop there a minute before we actually dig into code and look at code. We've got a couple of other questions here. Brian, okay. Hey, Brian, I will show how I made the global group in a bit toward the end of this. If not, you can post a question on the developer forum and we'll get it there. You also ask about the filter properties. I should have looked at this earlier. Let's see. Are the properties mutually exclusive? For example, if you don't set a group filter, does it make adding a queue filter irrelevant given the queue members need to be a member of the group? They're additive. So if you set an agent group and you set a queue filter, it's got to be the union of the Venn diagram of those those groups. Everything's a union. So wherever everything meets, that's ultimately what shows up. All right, and then oh great. So Brian, you created an idea for client application. All right. Brian, if you want to post that idea link into the chat so people see that, then maybe everybody can vote on that while we're in this. All right, so let's so we went through the boilerplate. Oh, chat is disabled. Is it? Let me see if I can enable that. attendees can chat with everyone. All right, give that a try, Ryan. I think that might do it. There we go. All right, that's working. All right, so let me get back to this. So we went through this mural flow. This is a typical boilerplate. And in fact, I have a boilerplate I use. I've developed my boilerplate interaction widget code. And every time I have to build an interaction widget, I start with that code, and it kind of just does the normal setup. And then I can concentrate on the business logic that I want in my interaction widget. So let's take a look at that. Got my code here. I won't go into a lot of detail, but I can share this with you if you want. It's actually out on GitHub pages for my favorites interaction widget. So it's not like it's hidden or anything. The first thing I do is I come in here and I say, where was my iframe loaded from? Because if I have to authenticate and it has to redirect back, I need to tell Genesys where to redirect back to. So I save off my URL where my iframe was loaded to. Then I check. I'm kind of just doing a little UI rendering here to say whether I'm authenticated coming through that first time or whether I am authenticated based on whether there's a status, not on status, whether there's a hash in the URL. So you can look at the different ways the URL looks on the initial load or on the redirect. They look different. So I'm looking for certain things and just rendering a UI item for the agent to let them know that we're in the middle of authentication. I parse those query parameters. So that was kind of one of the first things I do is I parse the query parameters and I save those off, and I'm going to use those in the state variable. I initialize my Client Apps SDK. So this is where I said you need that host origin and the target environment. You need to pass those in to initialize the SDK, and that'll initialize it. And then I'm going to initialize the Platform SDK so I can make API requests to the back end of Genesys Cloud. And I initialize that. I create an instance of it, and then I set the environment based on what the Client Apps SDK sees as the environment. So you have to initialize the Client Apps SDK because one of the things it sets up is the environment variable that points you to the right region for the Platform SDK. And then this one's kind of important and often overlooked. The Client Apps SDK and I mean the Platform SDK has the ability to persist settings. And what that means is after it authenticates and gets an access token, it can persist that in local storage so that if your iframe is loaded multiple times or reloaded multiple times, during authentication, during that authentication check, the Platform SDK will first check local storage and say, do I have an access token already that is not expired? And if so, it'll use it and it won't prompt the agent to log in. If you don't persist that and your iframe gets unloaded, you've lost your access token, right? If it was in memory and your widget or client app gets destroyed, memory goes away, you lose your access token, and the next time you come through, the agent's going to have to log in again. So persisting the settings is important. Just set that to true. You can, in the local storage, we can prefix your local storage items versus someone else's local storage items. So just give it a little tag that we'll put on the front of the items, and we'll put that in local storage. And then I set up a couple of variables off of the platform API that I'm going to call, and I initialize the application. So if I go look at that initialize application call, the first thing in there is I call the SDK and I want to do a login implicit grant. I pass it my client ID and that state string of the initial query parameters and the redirect URI. So if I have to authenticate, if the Genesys Cloud user login screen is going to render and replace my UI, I need to tell it to redirect back to Genesys, and I need, or back to my app, and I need that original query string, which I pass in the state parameter. So that's how I set those up, so that on the redirect back in, I can get back to my URL and I can get to the original query string parameters as well. After login is successful, and if it may not have to redirect, if it checks local storage and finds a valid access token for a previous authentication, it'll just drop through the promise and I can start doing authenticated things, such as getting who the logged in user is, querying for the conversation based on the conversation ID that came in, and getting those details. Now, we talked about lifecycle events, right? If you can tell if you're being bootstrapped, if you've got focus or blur, or whether your app is being stopped. You can set up listeners based off of your client SDK, Client Apps SDK. Off the lifecycle event, you can add a bootstrap listener, an on focus listener, an on blur listener, and an on stop listener, so that you are aware of when those events take place. I've got them in my boilerplate code, and I just show a toast. So up in the right-hand corner of the Genesys Cloud UI, you're going to see a little toast message, like where you would see errors or informational messages. You can show a toast up there from your client app or your interaction widget, and I just always I post up there whether I've got focus or not, just as an exercise to prove that things are working. Last thing I want to show you in this code is there's business logic, obviously, for my widget. And then there's the parsing of the query parameters. So I just have an object. I have an object that I maintain, app params, with the things that are going to be passed in on the query parameter. I just have some parsing logic that goes through the query string, pulls those things out, stores them off. The last one is so the first couple are on the original load of my iframe. I'm looking directly at the query string, and if I find a state query parameter, I know it's on the redirect. And so if I find a state parameter, I know that that contains the original query string. So I get that value, and I recursively call this so that I parse out the original query string. So it's not rocket science. Setting up the boilerplate for an interaction widget or a custom client app is really pretty easy. And once you get one set up, like I said, you can reuse that on every interaction widget or custom client app that you build. All right. I want to talk about a few more things. So we get some commonly asked questions that I want to talk about on client apps and interaction widgets. So we've already talked about, if you don't initialize the SDKs. So if you were to not set the environment on the platform SDK, if you forgot to do this, then when you call the implicit grant login or you try to make any API request, the platform SDK, if nothing is passed into it for the environment, is going to say, I'm going to look at US East. And so chances are your org is not in US East. So make sure you set that. That's a common problem. I get customers and partners that ping me a lot in that, their interaction widget's not authenticating, and they can't figure out why. And it's usually because they forgot to tell it what region their org is in by setting that environment. I talked about set persist settings. I get queries a lot about I'm getting asked to log in every time I handle an interaction, and I don't, it's a bad agent experience. So use the set persist settings so that we store off that access token. And then when your iframe loads for every new conversation, we can just reuse the access token until that access token expires or needs to be renewed. And that the SDK will take care of doing that for you, but you have to store that off by using the set persist settings. A lot of customers are using single sign-on. Okay, so they have single sign-on set up within Genesys, and the SDK, when you ask it to do an implicit grant or an authorization code grant login, if single sign-on is used, it will attempt to do an SSO login to your SSO provider. But many providers these days, Okta, Azure, GCP, they're not allowing their login screen to be iframed. So I get a lot of queries that, hey, my widget or my client app works great if it's Genesys auth, but if it's an SSO login, the login screen doesn't render. We have in the URL interpolation, there's this GC use pop-up auth. So if your organization is using single sign-on, or you're building a widget that has to work for a customer that uses single sign-on, then you probably need to set that use pop-up auth so that Genesys will pop up the single sign-on login screen in a separate standalone window, so that there's no iframe content policies. Websites and login SSO vendors can block being iframed by setting a content policy flag on the HTTP response, and it just won't render your UI in an iframe. So there's that. Let's talk about versioning for a minute. So and how to load the SDKs. So in the Client Apps SDK, there's a couple of ways to do this. If you're building stuff with NPN and on a back end or whatever, you can bring those into your Node app easy enough by just doing an npm install. If you're doing a pure client-side application where everything's HTML and JavaScript and there's no server side involved, you can use our CDN. Now, we have two different groups that maintain both of these SDKs. The Client Apps SDK is maintained by the UI group, and they do things version specific. So you have to put in 2.6.7 in the URL to load the rest of the SDK and load that specific version. So your app is going to be locked to that version of the SDK until sometime later we release a new version. We announce that, and you go through and update that to the latest version. The Platform SDK. So if I go look at that, hold on, that's down here, Platform SDK right here, and JavaScript. And I look at that. So that's also available through a CDN that you can load our SDK. And it also has versions related to it. We do support a latest. So if you don't want to be version specific for the Platform SDK, so the Platform SDK is the one that makes API requests to the back end. It's not the one interacting with the UI. It's give me the conversation JSON for this conversation ID, or give me users me, give me the JSON object for the user. You can specify latest. Now, that's just for the Platform SDK, and you might argue one way or the other whether to use latest or not. We've got some passionate developers here at Genesys who would say that you should never use latest because Genesys might release a version of the Platform SDK with something in it that would break your app, and you should always do something that is version specific. Put in the version specific, do your build, and know that your app will always work with that version, and then go through and update things as the versions change, so that you can do QA testing and stuff. So I'm not going to get philosophical in that argument on this webinar. You can choose what you want, but I did want to point out that the Platform SDK has a latest URL, whereas the Client Apps SDK does not, and that's the reason. The next common question I get is your web app may have URL links that you would want an agent to click on and load a separate tab, a separate window, whatever, right? And you might have an anchor link in your HTML that you want the agents to click on. Those will not work in our iframes. Our UI team specifically blocked anchor links from working. So if you're rendering click to dial telephone numbers in your UI or something like that, those are not going to work. And you have to use, it's in the Client Apps SDK, it's in the core UI section of that. We have an open window method that should be used to open a new tab or a new window based on the URL. So your web app, if there are things in the HTML that are clickable that you want to open a new window, you're going to have to hook to those, set some JavaScript that intercepts that click event on a URL and calls the Genesys Client SDK open window method to load that, to make that open. So that catches a lot of folks. Since client apps and interaction widgets are iframes, if you build a pure client-side application, so nothing but HTML and JavaScript running in the browser, no backend server, you are going to have to worry about CORS issues. So we iframe the URL that you set up. Hopefully that URL is within the domain where any requests that you need to make are going to go. If they don't go to that host, then you're going to have to make sure that if they go to a different host, that host has the proper CORS headers to allow requests from that domain to come through. So just know if you're building a pure client-side app, you've got to deal with CORS. Otherwise, you can build a server-side app, talk directly to your server and let your server do all the back-end communication, and then CORS issues disappear. The last kind of frequently asked question that I get is, I want to set up some initialization parameters for my integration, for my client app or my interaction widget. And we don't really have any kind of storage or JSON object that can be supplied on initialization to your app other than query string parameters. So what I recommend is to have a data store in your system somewhere or something that when your web UI loads, it can query the org ID, it can query the logged in user, it can query the conversation, and using a combination of those, you can send those to your back end to say, give me the configuration for my UI that's necessary based on those parameters. So, if you want to store customer specific configuration, like if you're an App Foundry partner and you want configuration for each of your customers to be isolated, you're going to have a data store on your side keyed by org ID. And when your interaction widget or client app loads, you'll have to query the org using the APIs, send that to your back end and say, give me the configuration for this org ID, and return that JSON to your app so that you render an app specific to that customer. Or, if you want to persist user specific settings, you might query the user ID, get the GUID of their user, and persist those settings for that user in your system, so that on subsequent renders, you've kept the settings that agent likes to see about your web app, and you can render them appropriately. So think I've covered what I meant to cover. We've got 5 minutes left. Let me see if there's any questions here in the Q&A. It looks like we don't have any. If you have any questions, please post them in here. I'll answer them for the next couple of minutes. Everything I talked about today is available out on the Developer Center. So you've seen me reference some articles here. The Client Apps SDK is available. If you don't remember where it's at, you can always just go up and put in Client App in the search, and the Client Apps SDK is going to be the top hit. It's going to take you there. Platform SDK is here. The Resource Center, if you put in Client App or Client Application or Interaction Widget, you'll get to the documentation on how to create those, how to configure them. Everything is available, and we will make the videos available on our video links. So if you go out to videos and go out to DevCasts, you can see all the previous DevCasts. We'll put this video out there shortly. Interestingly enough, not Interaction Widgets, but Client Apps was the third DevCast we ever did long ago. So you could go out and kind of look at that. I went back and reviewed that because it's been so long since I covered those. And amazingly enough, I decided to load up the app that I wrote for that. So I wrote a little game. I wrote a little game using JavaScript that, you got a little character here that runs along stars, and it subscribes to queues, calls in queues. So if I put a call in, and put that call into queue, let me go off queue. I don't think that call worked. Hold on, let me try that again. So I wrote this little app, and it listens to queue events, and when there's calls in queue, it drops bombs.
Hello, thanks for calling the DevCast Interact.
We should get a bomb here.
Please wait while I find an available agent.
So here come the bombs. So that call got in queue and the bombs dropped, and I have to avoid the bombs. But the really cool thing about that, and my point wasn't to show you the game or anything, but this client app was written probably 4 years ago, three or 4 years ago. I haven't touched it since I wrote it for that original DevCast, and it still works. So we do our best here at Genesys to make sure that we try not to break things. This is still running with a really old version of the Client Apps SDK, a really old version of the Platform SDK. And I did nothing but kind of re-enable this integration. It's still using the old deprecated query parameters, but it loaded right up and it ran. So we try to do our best to make things not break. So with that, we're at time. There's no more questions. Well, there is a question. Teresa, yes, this recording will be shared. It'll be out on the videos link on the Developer Center. So with that, I will wrap up. Thank you all for joining. And if you have any questions, post on the Developer Center forum, and we'll answer your questions from there. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.